So, yes. Are we recording? Because we can
Yes.
edit. Okay. So yeah, I'm deeply appreciative of you doing this. And I'm gonna have it uploaded on the podcast. Actually, that's the plan.
It's my pleasure.
Yeah. And so the topic actually it's you're a wonderful kind of bridge and resource because you are thoroughly situated in both worlds of sobriety and AA and recovery, as well as, of course, the Buddhist Dharma and that path as well. So together, it's a conversation for me to talk about the term, the practice, or should I say the philosophical underpinnings of deep sobriety, which the philosophical underpinnings is definitely Dharma, obviously.
Yes.
So go ahead.
Well, there's something I was thinking about a little bit when I guess it was Friday when we last talked, or Thursday, and then just now, um, that the experience of deep sobriety, meaning, and it's a profound meaning that you're describing,
Mm,
is a foundational establishment of what it really means to be sober. In other words, it's not just the absence of drugs or compulsive behavior,
mhm,
alcohol, etc. It's something much more than that, isn't it?
mhm,
But my the marrying of the two, as you put it, and even for me as a personal experience of deepening sobriety,
mhm,
uh, the understanding I have about myself in relation to the world
mhm,
through the Buddha's Dhamma
mhm,
wouldn't have been at all possible if it wasn't first establishing sobriety. The
mm,
reason why I'm making that point, and I've been thinking about it, it wasn't the Dhamma or any um, so-called advanced spiritual technique or understanding
mhm,
that led to my sobriety.
mhm,
It was my sobriety that led to and was the foundation for a deeper, and again, I use the word very loosely, a deeper spiritual understanding.
mm,
And I think that's an important point to make, and I make it to many. In my position, I get quite a few people that are um, afflicted by some type of compulsive behavior, whether it's drug and alcohol addiction, sex addiction, or watching too much TV, which
mhm,
in the long run is just as debilitating because you're missing your life. The solution wasn't the Dhamma. The solution was first addressing the gross behavior that was keeping me away from any type of so-called, again, spiritual understanding. And I'll stop using that word so-called because now I've said it twice and people know what I mean. So does that make sense, Dathane?
It does. It does. It does make sense. So let me ask you a question. Addiction from the standpoint of AA versus, and you can say, well, I mean, well, let me say the question. Addiction from the standpoint of AA versus addiction and craving from the standpoint of the Dharma. What difference do you see between the two, or no difference, or however you want to comment that?
Again, ultimately no difference.
Mhm,
The my behaviors as active uh, alcoholic and drug addict and other things. And you're compulsive, you're compulsive. Um, was I don't know. It's such a subtle. The 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 second noble truth, the first noble truth is that suffering occurs. That's certainly true for any alcoholic, drug addict, or anybody suffering from any compulsive behavior. You create your own suffering through that behavior. The second noble truth states that craving for and clinging to, and and the um, and the addiction, it's obviously craving for or clinging to what one is compulsive about. In the Dhamma, the much subtler and deeper level that we're talking about, isn't it, is craving for and clinging to fake or false views of who I am in relation to the world. And that deep craving manifests as the obvious craving of, let me have a drink, let me have a drug, let me have some more sex, let me have some more golf. And so as we continue to deepen our understanding of self in relation to the world and in relation to our addiction, we gain that understanding. But we can't get to that understanding without the gross or overarching understanding that, hey, I got to stop this behavior or I'm not going to have anything in my life.
Mm.
And
So,
that is,
okay.
please go ahead.
No, 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 no. I want you to finish your thought. Finish your thought, please.
Well, that's the difficult thing, and it's the problem with the way the 12-step programs have, and I'll use the word devolved because in my view they haven't evolved. And the problem for so-called spiritual seekers who get waylaid by exactly what they're looking for, what they're seeking. So when you're seeking an escape from something,
Hmm.
you're missing that underlying point that there's no escape from me, is there? There's only an understanding of me. And the remarkable thing to me, we talked about this just last week, I think it was last Monday, between the 12 steps and the Eightfold Path, is that they both address the core issue of self-centeredness. The 12 steps do that remarkably well and sufficient enough to maintain sobriety. The Eightfold Path simply takes us to that deeper level of deep sobriety because it addresses that key issue.
Mm.
Did that make sense?
Indeed, indeed it did. So why don't you because we had a conversation before about even why I'm using the term deep sobriety and how I'm not marry. I shouldn't use the word marry. How I associate it with dispassion, and how possibly, while the translation of, if I'm not mistaken, please definitely correct me, viragra, dispassion has been translated. Translate that probably has been translated as dispassion. I mean, it might come into a misunderstanding that it's unfeeling. It's you're reaching a state of unfeeling, almost like a Vulcan. It's tries to reach very much a dispassionate type of life. If we use the scientific kind of science fiction type of analogy.
Yeah.
But we're not talking about that with this kind of dispassion, which is why when I see someone who has reached a state of sobriety like yourself, the last thing I get from you is unfeeling. I get, very compassionate, warm, and yet dispassion is a very intimate part of that. Can you comment more about how that they're connected, sobriety and deep sobriety and dispassion, maybe that type of conversation?
It's the key to sobriety, to peaceful and lasting sobriety, and it's also the key to understanding the Buddhist Dhamma. Like the central theme of both recovery through the 12 steps and awakening through the Dhamma is a profound an understanding of the self in relation to the world, or in this case, whatever I'm compulsive about. And the deeper level, the deep sobriety, is that profound understanding of the self that goes way beyond the initial avoidance of what one is compulsive over. In other words, that's the foundation. I have to start there and manage that initial poor behavior before I can get into the deeper levels of sobriety. But you have to start there. And so when I'm active and 11 o'clock rolls around and I haven't had a drink yet, my passions are about how am I going to get that drink? And that's the thing that I'm most passionate about. And we're using a general term to describe something. And usually you wouldn't say that I'm passionate about getting my next drink, but that's exactly what we're talking about when using that word passion or dispassion. Mm-hmm. So recovery is finding a way, whatever the method might be, of becoming dispassionate about the next drink, or the next sexual encounter, or the next round of golf, or the next Facebook tweet, whatever it is that we're compulsive about, the next piece of chocolate cake. In order for me to not do that, I have to create within me dispassion for it. Because if I maintain passion for it, I'm always going to succumb. That's the essence of addiction, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Something arises within me and I want it now. And so no matter what, no matter all the difficulties in the past that it brought me, I go ahead and do it. So the counter to that is becoming dispassionate about initially the object of my compulsion. And then I can start addressing the compulsive nature that I hope to establish this self in the world, which is ultimately the same compulsion. Now, again, I hope I made sense there.
No, no, it did. You did. Yeah, definitely you did.
So
Here's
we
a
don't want.
go ahead.
And you're also talking about one of the first things that I encounter in my students, where their first objection or aversion to the Dhamma resides, and it's just that point, whether they completely understand it or not. Most don't at that point, because when you first start understanding the Eightfold Path, there can be and often is this initial wrong view that doesn't just mean I'm annihilating myself. And because that's what that feels like when I start diminishing my passion for maintaining wrong views of self in relation to the world, it does feel like annihilation. And an initial overview of what the Buddha teaches often looks like that. What's going to happen to me? In fact, that's often the question is, well, when I develop this understanding of self and let go of all wrong views of self and I'm dispassionate, what happens to me? What's going to be my motivation? And you just said to me, I'm like everyone else. I wondered about that when I started understanding the implications of what the Buddha actually taught. And what kept me going, what got me past that fear, is the Buddha's own teaching, where he said, in order for you to understand this, you have to experience it. And if I relied on my past experiences, which were rooted in fear, I wouldn't allow myself to experience it. But built in the Dhamma, if one actually engages directly in the Dhamma, is the support and the encouragement to get past that fear. And it simply begins in right meditation, jhana meditation, and uniting the mind and the body right where it is in that present moment. Meaning in this moment, when I take a breath, unite my mind and my body, in that moment, I'm at peace with myself. And in that peaceful moment, I can then gain that deeper insight that you're talking about. But there has to be that initial take a breath and become dispassionate in this moment. And when I have established dispassion in this moment, then I can build on that. Again, that's the whole foundation. You can say, another way of saying that is jhana meditation is the foundation for the entire Eightfold Path, but it's not the path, is it? Stopping my compulsive behavior is the initial foundation for my recovery, but recovery is much more than that, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. You know, John, you wrote a book called The Spiritual Solution.
Yes, sir.
And you did I find and we went, actually you took me through it, and we are, kind of in the journey of that, which is I'm deeply appreciative of that, of the 12-step AA process, which is much more what's the word I would use, succinct, and maybe traditionally rooted back to the original teachers themselves and how they approached it. Without the need of going into deep psychotherapeutic, or taking one step for 1 month, another step for another month, and you did it all in a 2-hour session, which was very, very wonderful. Have you ever this is a question that came up for me, because what you say about the need, especially for an addict, to really get a hold of that gross behavior, which is where that gross compulsion, which is where the 12 steps really assist in doing that, and then going into a deeper exploration of what it deeply means to be sober, what the Eightfold Path and the Dharma does. Have you ever thought about actually, well, not only that, have you ever, let me say it like this, have you ever thought about translating, I shouldn't say that, reinterpreting, reframing the 12 steps in Buddhist kind of language, and then and it's because it'll be I find it to be especially for those who may not always, there's that higher power religiosity, little bit of kind of could be a barrier. So for those that don't want that, which is why Kevin Griffin, I don't know if you're familiar with him, or Noah Levine, there are people who are really interested in that because it doesn't have that overarching Christian language. but you do it in a way which is really bringing it down to a 2 hour power session, and then really getting focused on, you know, three aspects of the steps to make sure they're on that path. So two things. My two questions are: one, have you ever thought about doing a reinterpretation of that from the Buddhist perspective? And two, if you could go through the various steps from a Buddhist perspective, how would you do it? That's a tall order, maybe, from one.
It isn't, but it's such a great question. And I actually did that in response to the religiosity that is actually more rampant in 12-step programs today than it ever was in the beginning, which turns off a lot of people. Remind me of the second question, because I'll probably forget it, but I want to
Oh,
get into this first.
yeah.
Uh,
Hmm.
the two things you talked about. One is going through the 12 steps in a couple hours. That is how they were intended. They were never meant to be this long, drawn out process. And the only reason it developed that way is because of the influence of a more modern so-called psychological slash rehab structure to it. In other words, you go to a rehab for 3 weeks or 4 weeks, there's something they got to do for those 4 weeks besides just letting you detox. And a lot of it has been an expansion and an embellishment of the original 12 steps to fill up a month's worth of therapeutic time. And it's destroyed the effectiveness of the 12 steps. And that's proven by the modern recovery rate has been about 2 or 3% for the last 50 years, where the first 20 years of AA and other 12-step programs, it was growing exponentially. The reason is we've gotten away from that simple, direct way of taking the 12 steps as it were intended, and then getting to that, your second question, which I'll expand on in a few moments. The important thing about the steps and the Dhamma is that they immediately get to the problem of self-centeredness. The ultimate, through the Dhamma, it's ultimately a deeper look, deep sobriety, but the 12 steps as intended do just what they were supposed to do or intended to do. Address the problem of addiction in this moment. In other words, for most people, especially those that are addicted to drugs and alcohol, there's an immediate life or death situation for many people. It better work quickly. And the reason why so many people continue to die, even within the 12-step community, is they don't do that. So the 12 steps, when taken as they were intended, immediately gets to that problem of self-centeredness. And so that leads to your second question, the three questions. So the last three steps, the 10th, 11th, and 12th steps, are we continue to take a personal inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly admitted it. The 11th step is thought through prayer and meditation. It's an important part, that second part, to improve our conscious contact with God. The 12th step is we practice these principles in all our affairs and try to help others. Those three things are the continuing spiritual aspects of the program that are often completely overlooked. In other words, because it's misapplied. That simple look at a personal inventory is just looking at myself in relation to a certain criteria of behavior that we've established for ourselves. And that is simply speaking and acting honestly and without harm towards others and ourselves, and living our lives that way within that framework. And the inventory in the beginning for people just establishing the 12 steps is that it starts training us to look at our own behavior, which most people don't want to do, and especially people that are compulsive. And so that initial act in the beginning starts getting us to look deeper at ourselves, deepening our sobriety. The next step, sought through prayer and meditation. If you are not someone who is prayerful or believes in a God, there's no reason to pray. It doesn't make any sense. But there is that second component of meditation that most people in 12-step programs either don't understand and so don't do it properly, but most of the time, since they don't understand it, they don't do it. And that leaves out any possibility for deepening your understanding of yourself if you're not practicing that component of it. And then that last part of practicing these principles, which is the same principles of self-honesty and remaining harmless, and then taking that understanding to other people. Getting back to where this all began, self-centeredness in the big book, it says self-centeredness is the root of our trouble. Self-centeredness is the essence of addiction. That simple act that is described in the 12th step of helping others is the direct and most practical counter to self-centered behavior, isn't it? And that's what's often that's what's often missed by people that teach the 12 steps and take it in such a protracted way, because you never get to that point where you're actually helping others immediately, are you? It's a year or sometimes years in the future. And frankly, most people never get there. It just takes too long. When you do the steps the way they're intended in an hour and a half or 2 hours, you immediately have the tools to continue to maintain your own sobriety, not reliant on someone else who may not be all that reliable to begin with. You have it within your means. That's the way the 12 steps were intended, that a sponsor gives their sponsor the means to establish their own sobriety. And from that point on, then the sponsor is merely guiding the sponsee. In my case, what we did, I'm just guiding you towards continuing your work in the 12 steps. And that leads to those 3 questions that a good sponsor will ask their sponsee. What are you doing today? What's in your inventory? What self-centered behaviors are showing up in your inventory? How is your meditation practice? Because I need to know that if I'm going to continue to guide you. I want to encourage you to continue that practice. And the last question is, what are you doing to help others with your same problem? That's that direct and practical act of diminishing my self-centeredness. And if I leave that out, either because I'm disinterested in helping myself and others, or I don't understand what my sponsor taught me, so I'm not prepared to take others through the steps, then the whole steps are useless in that way. They don't work. That's why we end up with a 2 or 3% recovery rate for the last 50 years.
Wow. That's really, go ahead, John.
Now, to get back to what you said about what do you do for people that the 12 steps don't work for many reasons. And there's many problems with modern 12-step programs that the 12 steps themselves can't change because people aren't doing it. And so I created something called mindfulness-based recovery, which uses the eightfold path in the almost exactly the same way as the 12 steps. And so I could have reinterpreted the 12 steps and taken out some of the language, but the structure was already in place, and a structure that I know works very well. So the people that I've helped that had trouble with the 12 steps and didn't want anything to do with modern AA or NA or the other 12-step program were very successful in incorporating the eightfold path because it addresses the same issue. But again, I go back to that key. The key to any of that is that you have a desire to deal with your compulsion. There's no magic pill out there. The 12 steps won't work. The eightfold path won't work. Nothing will work. If the compulsive person does not have the desire to actually change. And from that, then you can build deep sobriety on. But that's important. It can't be overlooked.
Yeah, wow, that's really great. That's really wonderful. Let me ask you this. How about if you can take us through a 1-for-1 reinterpretation? If you go through the 12 steps 1-for-1, if we stated 1-for-1 and say, okay, well, this is what the 12 steps says, but if we were to look at it from a Dharma perspective, this is how you would language it. And then step 2, this is how the Dharma will language it. Could you go through with us? I think people might be interested in how that would may look like.
Yeah, let me give it a shot.
Yeah.
The first step is we admitted we were powerless over alcohol, using alcohol as the focus there, and that our lives had become unmanageable. So another word for admitting, not quite as strong, is that I understand. And that really is, again, it's rooted in that take a minute and actually take an honest look at yourself. But so the first step would be the entry point into the rest of the steps, or the first step would be the entry point into a deeper understanding. So it's just coming to the realization that I understand that as a result of my behaviors, whatever it is, that in relation to those behaviors, my life is unmanageable. And anybody who's taking an honest look, anybody who's truly compulsive about something and takes that first honest look would have no trouble admitting that or understanding it. So that's the entry point. I understand I have a problem. What's the next step? Power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. The second step is came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. The problem again is the religiosity of that. And we have to remember that the 12 steps were founded in Christian ideology. And that doesn't immediately preclude them from being effective. They're still effective. I personally have a problem with Christian ideology, and even more so as I get older. But again, that doesn't have to stop me. It might stop you from most people in AA doing this, because many people are compulsive about the religiosity of the program. But it's simply understanding that a power, let me go back just a little bit. If the problem with addiction is extreme self-centeredness, a power greater than that self would be anything that would diminish that self-centeredness. That's a power greater than that self. And the continuing aspects of recovery will certainly diminish that. So if you can accept the notion, and this, and I often take people through the steps who are strongly anti-religious by saying just this way: if you can accept the fact that the 12 steps, and there are proven, this isn't a fabricated belief. I'm not just taking it on faith. If you understand that the process of the 12 steps will give you the power that you're lacking right now, then you have taken the second step. So the question, I guess, would be, do you believe that this process will support you in your recovery? And if the answer, I'm sorry.
No, I just for I mean, yeah, you definitely hit the nail on the head. And you use the word process. And that for me, when I heard you say that word, that for me is the direct link to the Buddhist practice, because the Buddhist practice, as you know, dependent co-origination, the Four Noble Truths, all these are a process to understand how your suffering occurs, how you do maybe quite possibly do self-inflicted suffering. So the power, the greater power, can be seen, and I feel it's a direct link to the Buddhist practice, a process, and that could be something which you can carry on to once you get a handle and do the 12 steps. Now you're going into a deeper process of the Dharma. I don't know how does that ring with you?
Yeah, that's exactly it. It's an ongoing process. The key to it is that the process has to be it has to be authentic. It has to be unembellished. Especially, I mean, I've been at this for a long time, and excuse me, that's the one thing that I found that otherwise sincere, practitioners or developers of sobriety, is that they want to maybe change it in what seems like slight ways, insignificant ways. But anytime the 12 steps are changed or altered in any way, they become ineffective. And I've seen the same thing through the Eightfold Path. When it's adapted or accommodated, it's always to preserve some kind of wrong view. And in the case of direct addiction, it's a wrong view that continues at addiction. In the case of the Eightfold Path, it's a wrong view that prevents the deepening process of deepening sobriety. So authenticity to the process is important, especially as we recognize that it's a process. You have to maintain the process.
Indeed. So now the third one.
What was the third one? Oh, the third step. So the third step, the third step is a decidedly Christian prayer. So we can eliminate that. And by the way, with as we're reinterpreting the 12 steps, we don't have to reinterpret it towards the 12 steps. It's okay to eliminate some of the steps. And there's a reason for that. There's a foundation for that. The original 12 steps, when developed between Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob Smith, the two co-founders of AA, was originally 6 steps. And Bill Wilson had, him and Dr. Bob clashed often, and they clashed on this one thing of keeping it as simple as possible. Bill Wilson was a bit of a mystic even back then. And there's some things that are not known about Bill Wilson that were left out. And I won't get into them, but that were extraneous to what eventually became the 12-step practice. He was interested in a lot of other things. One of the things was the number 12. He was into numerology. and he felt that there was some significance to having 12 steps as opposed to 6. So he expanded some of them. Step 6 and 7 are a good example of that. They really are just one step, but he wanted 12, so he split it up in 2. The third step being a prayer, where I've taken the first step. I'm starting to understand that I have compulsive problems. I've taken the second step. I've inclined my mind towards this process that is a power greater than my self-centered compulsive self. The third step in the original process is, okay, and now I'm stating a prayer. In my understanding, a prayer is simply stating a strong intention that something occur. And within a prayer, it's usually a plea to an outside agency that's seen as a God-like being, and to stop being cute about it, to God. I'm making an appeal to God that something happened in my life, and that something is that God continues to provide the means for my recovery. Without the prayer, it's simply that continued decision that we've taken in the second step. I am determined to continue with this process to establish my sobriety. That's exactly, in practicality, the same thing as the third step prayer. So here in the third step, I'm going to continue with this process because I understand it will establish my sobriety. And that leads us, please.
No, yeah. Well, I'm sorry. Great. I did this. A question did pop to mind. To even play a little bit devil's advocate, I would think that in AA there is an important aspect of surrendering to this other power that helps one to overcome their addiction. So, but as you know, in Buddhism, I remember even with the Buddha, he not a guy big on prayer, actually, from stories that I've read. Like there was one story where someone asked the Buddha, "Please pray for my father to go into a happy rebirth." And the Buddha said, looking at the stream, he's like, okay, well, let's pray for, those rocks at the bottom of the stream to come up to the surface. Pray as hard as you want. So, yep. so he has a bit of a kind of a little when it comes to prayer.
He has more than a little, and he's got a great sense of humor, doesn't he?
So, but go ahead. Well, my question is, but is there a space in surrendering in the Buddhist path? Like I suppose surrendering to the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, taking refuge. Maybe that's a surrender.
That was my answer as you asked the question. There really, you could say that we surrender to the triple refuge. The triple refuge, sometimes they're called the three jewels, are the taking refuge in the Buddha, his Dhamma, and a well-focused Sangha. What that means is that and again, when the taking refuge is not an act of faith. We can only take refuge. Refuge means that we've found a place of comfort and safety. And as Dhamma practitioners, we understand and take refuge in the Buddha, meaning that we understand that a human being developed this teaching, which means that I can take refuge in it as a human being. I can do the same. That's true refuge in taking refuge in the Buddha. He left his teachings for all of us. And we know that if you actually read the Sutta Pitaka. And so we can take comfort and safety in the fact that, yes, here's his teachings. I can do this myself. And he also taught that the most important thing, as he related to his cousin Ananda, is a well-focused Sangha. And so when we can find a well-focused Sangha, we can actually take refuge in that. So we aren't taking any of this on faith, but we are taking all of that as the direction for our process. So in relation to the third step, that's all that we're doing. We're establishing the conviction in ourselves to take that refuge. Now, in a person in the early stages of recovery, it's a little bit too deep to go into all of that. Just to understand that in this moment, this process will help me with my addiction. And as I continue, as I get deeper into the process, then it starts addressing the levels of deep sobriety, which are really in the way we're framing this in the last 3 steps. Excuse me.
Okay, so why don't we go to step 4?
So step 4 is the key to to the whole 12 steps, and probably the main reason why it simply doesn't work anymore, because it's either misrepresented or it's taken in such a way, I guess it's the same thing as misrepresented, to not be effective. The original 12 steps had a simple checklist that actually Dr. Bob first developed, that simply has us look at our self-centered behaviors, and there's a list of them, 7 of them, in relation to the people in our lives. And the brilliance of that is, we think about it, if my recovery depends on me recognizing and diminishing, at the very least, my self-centered behavior, I need a vehicle to do that, don't I? Excuse me.
Yeah.
And so the brilliance of the co-founders of AA was just this simple inventory process. It was never meant to be a written narrative of our entire life, because if you look at that closely, that's just rehashing the same thinking that got you stuck in addiction in the first place. It's a simple look at your self-centered behavior. And the reason why we have people on that list is because our behaviors come up in relation to other people, don't they? And that's just that's the looking glass. How's my behavior in relation to so-and-so? And how does my self-centered behavior manifest? And so we simply get a good look at it. That's the 4th step. And so there really doesn't need to be any reinterpretation into the Dhamma, because the Dhamma looks at exactly the same thing, self-centered behavior. The list is slightly different that I developed in mindfulness-based recovery, because it maybe it goes a little bit deeper, because it relates behavior directly to factors of the Eightfold Path. But that's the only difference. And so then the 5th step is we had a I can't remember the exact words, but we had a conversation about what we discovered in our 4th step with a higher power and with our sponsor, someone that's helping us along. And again, that's just a simple review like we did while we took the 4th step. You're actually taking the 5th step at the same time when the 12 steps are done in the way they're meant to be. I can't think of the word for it. Yeah, I can't think of the words. And in relation to discussing the 5th step with a higher power, we're doing it. That, again, if we move away from that idea that there's some external being listening to us, it's just the internal process of going through that is the same thing, isn't it?
And I would think that the quote unquote higher power and taking refuge, I mean, talking with different, people of the community, a spiritual community, well-focused Sangha.
Yeah. That's
And
right.
consulting the Dharma and how that reflects. Maybe I'm not. I don't know. Could be at that step, but maybe not. But also, of course, your sponsor being part of the that Sangha, but also the Dharma, and and you said that you said something that's really interesting that kind of causes me to pause. Just carrying the 3 jewels into the 5th step. There's something about me being authentic as a human being, and that I can myself undergo liberation just like the Buddha can. That for me is an empowering space that I can kind of consider. So I don't know, it's just something that comes up for me as a way to find some self-compassion, some possibility that can be, and that's another word that's pretty interesting. The possibility, the potential to be awakened could be also that greater power. I don't know. That's just
Absolutely, Dathane. I look at it the same way. This aspect of the 12 steps, taking an honest look at yourself in a structured way through a simple list, to me is the essence of self-compassion, isn't it? Because now, for the first time in my life, I'm actually involved in a process. I'm actually involved in a process that's going to do me some good. I'm going to learn about myself, and I'm going to learn directly. Again, the brilliance of the 12 steps and the brilliance of the Eightfold Path. I'm going to learn directly what I am contributing to my own confusion, stress, and suffering, and deluded thinking, so that I can change it myself. So there's the 12 steps are this amazing process of absolute self-compassion, and so is the Eightfold Path. There's no difference. Again, the Eightfold Path just takes our sobriety established through the 12 steps or established in the Eightfold Path to a much deeper level with continual engagement in the same process that established sobriety in the first place, whether it's the 12 steps or the Eightfold Path. And so this is where we're getting into the, where Bill kind of embellished a little bit on the 12 steps. The sixth step, the simple statement, it said, humbly ask him, in reference to a male God, humbly asked him to remove these shortcomings. And then just for a little clarity, that we just identified in the fourth and fifth step. So again, it's an extraneous step that Bill added just to make up 12, but it leads to then the seventh step, which is another prayer, which asks the same thing. So you can easily combine the sixth and the seventh step by the simple statement that I understand what my self-centered issues are, and my commitment to myself is to continue to recognize and abandon those self-centered behaviors. That's the seventh step in Dhamma terms. The eighth step is even simpler, and it's another good example of how Bill added just to make up 12. The eighth step says that we're entirely ready to have that higher. No, that's not the eighth step. Yes, it is. I mischaracterized the sixth step because I got them mixed up. The sixth step is, as I said, the eighth step said, I can't remember the exact verbiage. It's something like that. We're ready to go out and undo what has been done. Then the ninth step says we make a commitment to do just that, to go out to all people we have harmed and make amends, except when to do so would injure them or others. This is the one we hear about often on TV and stuff, the ninth step, to make an amends step. And so it simply means that now that I understand the harm I've done others, I am going to go out and make a sincere apology and set that right, which also means many people in addiction might steal money or other things that are illegal. You make a commitment to yourself to undo those things. And that begins to reintroduce yourself into society in your own mind. In other words, these things that I've done to hurt people and maybe even illegal things are the things in my mind that are keeping me from re-entering society as a sober person. And if I don't address those, whether through the Eightfold Path or the 12 steps, I'm never going to reach that deep sobriety. In fact, I would say you'll never be able to establish any meaningful sobriety if you don't take that important step of making amends. So in Dhamma terms is, now that I understand the harms that I've done others, I am going to make those amends. That's pure Dhamma too, isn't it? Yeah. Because in the Dhamma, when we understand through the virtuous factors of right speech, action, and livelihood that we've harmed others, we naturally would apologize or set it right. And as we are mindful of that, from the framework of the Eightfold Path, that types of behavior diminishes too. Again, our self-centered behavior starts to diminish, which is the whole point of the 12 steps and the Eightfold Path. So the 10th step said we continue to take personal inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly admitted it. That's the same exact thing as the same exact process as the fourth step, except we're simply creating that list on a daily basis by ourselves without the support of a sponsor. So you don't even need any change in the language to make it relate to the Dhamma. Today, I'm going to take an inventory, and if I find that I've hurt someone, I'm going to promptly set it right. That's the 10th step. There's no religiosity about that, is there? It's a continued process. Yeah. The 11th step is even simpler. In the Dhamma, we don't pray because let me say that a different way. As a Dhamma practitioner, I accept the fact that as far as my life is concerned, my moment by moment life, an external higher power is unimportant, insignificant. It simply doesn't matter. I'm saying it like this because we don't have to get into the argument, is there a God or isn't there a God? It doesn't matter at this point. Personally, I don't think there is, but I don't have to consider it. In this moment, I'm going to seek through meditation to improve my conscious understanding of who I am in relation to the world. And when you think about most of the descriptions of what God is the world, isn't it? We put on God the things that we see in the world. So it really is the same thing, saying it that way and kind of cutting out the middleman.
Yeah.
I'm going to engage in a meditation practice, and my instruction would be, my suggestion would be jhana meditation. I'm going to engage in jhana meditation to continue to improve my understanding of who I am in relation to the world, to continue to improve, as a metaphor, to continue to improve my understanding of God. It's the same thing in that way. So there's the 11th step. And my commitment is I commit to meditating twice a day, every day. And the 12th step, which states, having had a spiritual awakening as a result of taking these steps, we try to practice all of these principles in all our affairs and to help others. From a Buddhist perspective, it simply means keeping your mind united in your body. So now that I've gone through this process of the 12 steps, I have awakened. My spiritual awakening is that I need to and must maintain a mind united in its body as best as I can. And practicing these principles in all my affairs simply means I continue to diminish my self-centered thoughts, words, and deeds. And when the opportunity arises, I am going to be of service to others. And in a very meaningful way, for someone who's recovering from rather extreme addictions, the best way to continue to establish that is to find others with similar or the same addictions and simply teach them what you know. Excuse me. So if we're using the Eightfold Path or mindfulness-based recovery to establish our sobriety, the way to deepen it, and you're doing it on a kind of a grand scale, but even on a one-to-one scale, you will be diminishing your self-centeredness every time you sit down and spend a few minutes with someone like you, meaning struggling with some type of compulsive behavior, and simply explaining to them what you do. That's the most powerful aspect of selflessness that we can engage in. But I thank you for the question and the challenge. I hope I did okay by rephrasing the 12 steps.
No, I think you did wonderfully. I think you did marvelously. I won't keep you long. What time? How much time can you give me? Are you good for one more question?
I got as much time as you need, Dathane, really.
Oh, so that's so generous of you. Here's the thing that really for me is the cherry on top of the movement from sobriety to deep sobriety, and especially how this is informed and vehicled by the Dharma and the Eightfold Path, is in sobriety. I don't hear too much about happiness. I hear about getting off of, and actually as you talked about the 12 steps as being a way to get to get a handle on this gross compulsion, and for that to be its area of interest, that's fine. It should. It's like a tool that you need to get that before you can get to the other stuff. So once you get that under control, and you go to the deeper of deep sobriety, then for me, deep sobriety is the very slippery slope to what we mean by happiness or sukha. And so, yeah.
That's just wonderful, because you're also commenting on something that is prevalent in modern 12-step programs, and it's because they got away from the 12 steps. There's a word in Dhamma practice called upekkha, which means joyful enthusiasm, joyful enthusiasm with the Dhamma. In fact, it's one of the 7 factors of awakening or enlightenment that are recognized as necessary by the Buddha. It's not just this grudging engagement with Dhamma practice that gets us there. In fact, if that's our attitude, we're going to stop it. Nobody can maintain some kind of grudging engagement with anything. I don't care what it is. And so at some point, a good sponsor will help you develop upekkha, or joyful enthusiasm, for Dhamma practice by simply pointing out that anybody who's lived a life rooted in compulsion has lived a pretty miserable life, at least in some aspects. So the simple notion that here's a way out of that miserableness should help you generate some joy for what you're doing, some joyful enthusiasm, or at least it should be pointed out that way. Another reason why it's important to take the 12 steps the way they're intended is that at the end of that process, you have some encouragement and understanding of what you can do to maintain your own sobriety. That's empowering. That's sukha. That is self-compassion, to understand that. And it's so important to get to that point early in the process, whether it's early in the Dhamma or early in our sobriety, and meaning our direct sobriety. So that's an important component that is often lost. And so anybody that goes to a 12-step meeting today, and I'm talking in general terms, there's exceptions to this in certain meetings, but most of the meetings all over the world, there's over about 2 million people in 12-step programs today, which, by the way, hasn't grown at all in 55 years. You'll find meetings that are characterized by people talking about all the things that are wrong with them. It's demoralizing and it's debilitating, and there's no place for it. 12-step meetings were meant to be places where people that understood the 12 steps, had taken the 12 steps, find other people to take through the 12 steps. They're never meant to be this constant rehashing of all the things that are wrong with this broken self. We're not broken people. We have an issue that we can deal with, and we can deal with it gracefully and gently and directly and recover, whether it is through the initial establishment through the 12 steps or the deeper sobriety that is continued through the last 3 steps of the 12 steps, or even deeper through the Eightfold Path, or some type of structured way of understanding who we are in relation to the world. So again, I hope I answered that question and made the point you were making.
You did, and I think we've come to a good time. I think we probably on 45 minutes. It seems. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I never look at the clock when I'm talking to you. It's too much fun.
Well, that's good for a podcast. It shouldn't be too long because people are like, okay, we got it. Yeah, so forth. But thank you so much, John. That you answered a lot. You answered a lot. You navigated through a lot. You even brought the relationship between the 12 steps and the Dharma, and how they can be mutually beneficial, and how one can segue wonderfully into another once you get what the common underpinnings are. It seems to me, from what you were saying, and that's great.
I mentioned to you a week ago that if I saw a picture of Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob Smith in Buddhist robes, it wouldn't surprise me. They weren't Buddhists at all, but because of the close similarity to the 12 steps in the Eightfold Path, it's remarkable.
Okay.
And this was remarkable too. It was so much fun.
Yeah.
I'll do a little editing and I'll set this off to you.
Oh, great. That would be wonderful. Thank you so much, John. This will be wonderful. I'm gonna put it up, and of course your picture be nice and bright about being the main speaker and giving this wonderful teaching and wisdom that you did. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. I'll talk to you soon.
All right.